Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in today's video what we're going to do is show that Christianity created science, that it was Christianity that created science, and we're going to give reason and evidence for that. This will be a historical video, but what I like to do as best I can with history is not make specific references to specific sources to back up my claims. That's not that that's a bad thing, but I like to take it one step beyond and make claims that are relatively uncontroversial or easy to look up for yourselves. So especially in our modern age of the internet. So instead of giving you a reference I got this from this book place, it's that book says that, and you could go dig up some book that says something else. So I try to make points that you could look up easily, and whatever source you look it up in, you'll find that I said the same thing your source says. So that's how I try to go about things with these historical videos as best I can. And I want to give you good evidence and reasoning for the claim that Christianity created science. And this is really important. It's important because of this. So let's just take a look at the Gospel of John and the 14th chapter. Sorry, my keyboard's messing up. John 14. Alright, John the 14th chapter. And we're going to scroll down to the 10th verse. Or we'll start in the 9th verse. It said, Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip, even after I've been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." Okay, so when he says believe in me on the evidence of the works themselves, he's talking about the miraculous deeds that he did. And Jesus obviously performed lots of miracles. What he says is, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. So Jesus performed lots of miracles. He healed people of blindness. He raised the dead. He cured leprosy. He cast out demons, performed exorcisms. People had, I think one person had a withered hand. One woman had some sort of bleeding problem. I guess she'd had a multi-year long period, menstrual period. I don't know how that worked. He turned the water to wine. There were miracles of food production, like the loaves and the fishes and the feeding of the 5,000. He walked on the water. He calmed the storm with a word. These were, really impressive, miraculous things that he did. So, he says here that whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And so, the point I want to make is Christianity actually created science. Not just that it happened, not just that it just so happened that Christianity and the Christian world created science. That's relatively uncontroversial. But it's even this further point that's really not really controversial either, is that Christianity, the religion, there was a causal link between Christian theology and doctrines, etc., and morals and Christian views. There was a causal link between that and the creation of science. Christianity caused science to be created. It didn't just so happen that it was within the Christian world. And then, if we talk about performing miracles, we tend to think of miracles as things that would be miraculous from our perspective, but we need to sit back and recognize that from someone living in Jesus's day, modern science would be miraculous. It would be a miracle. It would be incredible to them. It would absolutely qualify as a miracle to them. So for example, Jesus fed the 5,000. Well, we do have a modern science version of that. The whole world up until 1850, over half the people, I think it's 56-ish % of people had to work in agriculture and food production in some way, shape, or form. Today, I think it's 1 point something percent. It's less than 2%. It's between 1 and 2% of people work in food production and produce enough food to feed way more people on this planet than remotely. I think human population has doubled in the last 70 years on this planet. So and yet we have extra food. There's places in the world that don't have enough food, but that's a problem of it's due to political problems. Why people, there's people that want to give them food and try to send them food, and there's extra food that's being sent to them all the time, and they can't get to them because of political issues. So the reality is, we've kind of fed the 5,000 in a way. You know what I mean? In some senses, it's greater than the miracle Jesus performed. Now, Jesus did it rather instantaneously, and we use modern farming technology. The biggest breakthrough is probably just fertilizer. There was a scientist in World War I who was trying to create nitrogen to make bombs more cheaply, and he ended up creating fertilizer by accident. And the process for how modern fertilizer is made, and we're still trying to improve on our farming techniques. There's all sorts of cool new improvements, but let's face facts. The feeding of the 5,000, kind of happened. For example, I have some really thick eyeglasses, and my vision is a -9.5. And if I was to live in Jesus' day, I would be one of those blind people asking for money. I couldn't work. I couldn't see very well. I would basically be blind in their day. And yet, the eyeglasses were invented in the medieval world, and it's a huge breakthrough because here I am, I'm 40 years old. I'm more capable and more productive than I've ever been in my life as far as things that I know how to do. I'm better at doing things than I've ever been before in the work that I can do, and yet it would stink really bad if my vision was the worst it's ever been in my life. So people over 40 are the people who you really want working and in building and creating things, and it's a huge leg up for those people to have glasses. But now, we have contacts, and we even have LASIK surgery where we can correct your vision with a magic machine that shoots a magic energy beam at your eye in a special way, and can correct your vision. This is wizard level stuff, and it's something somebody was telling me last week. And oh yeah, you should, you'll be glad you did it. It'll save you money in the long run, but pay for the expensive one. I was like, wow, just magical wizard beam, that would absolutely be seen as miraculous to someone in Jesus' day, a miracle. Cure for blindness. Now, we can't cure blindness in every way, shape, or form, especially someone born blind, but there's a possibility that we may be able to pull some of that off, so modern science is essentially a miracle. They say that Abraham Lincoln had more in common with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob than he did with us in terms of scientific technology. It's just amazing. The fact that we can just ride around in vehicles that don't need an animal to pull it would have blown their minds. And it burns a fluid that we like get out of the ground that's like super deep in the ground, and we know how to find this fluid with like special tools that can see through the ground. We have cameras. They didn't have cameras at all in the ancient world, but we have cameras that can see in the dark. Here's an example. When the King James Bible was translated in 1611, only the King of England, only King James, could afford fresh ham and eggs for breakfast in the morning. Fresh ham and eggs, because you had to literally slaughter the pig, or else the meat would spoil, pretty quick. So you had to slaughter the pig and cook the meat right away, or else salt it. But today, through modern refrigeration technology, it's no big deal for you to have fresh ham and eggs for breakfast in the morning. You can go to McDonald's and pick up a ham biscuit. You're literally eating like a king. And we joke about it. It's like, oh yeah, I feel like the food of kings. You know what I mean? Like the McDonald's ham biscuit. And I think they have a salted ham biscuit, but like it would be no big deal for you to like, buy some ham, fresh ham, and keep it in the fridge and fry you up a biscuit in the morning. It'd be no big deal. The food of kings. You know what I mean? Well, we're literally eating like kings. Up until 1890, the best scientific information, wisdom that we had for like what causes disease was bad smells, the miasma theory. Whereas it was in 1890 when they realized that like these little microscopic life forms was making us sick. And then it took a long time for people to accept it. Basically you had to have some pandemics break out, some epidemics, and like the treatments for those diseases based on modern medicine technology was like clearly working, so people kind of got on board then. And that really changed how people live and how people see disease. Before that, people didn't really believe in germs. If it didn't smell bad, there was nothing wrong, So like in the 1890s, people would put wallpaper in the bathroom, and like, if you were rich enough to even have an indoor bathroom, but they wouldn't think about germs. Like they would just have a cloth, a couch in there they would sit on, and it'd get all nasty, and as long as it didn't stink, it was okay. The wallpaper was like really busy so that you could like swat a fly, and it wouldn't, and you could just leave the dead bug on the wall, and like you couldn't tell it was there. And that's how the wallpaper was done, like even in the bathroom. So like things have changed so much. In the ancient Roman world, they used to like go looking for little quartz rocks. And quartz is a crystal, but like it's not clear because there's impurities in it. But if you can find one that has little to no impurities in it, it'll be clear. And they thought those were like magical crystals that like you could look into and like see things. Things happening on the other side of the world, or like, something like that. Well, your phone is literally that. Some magic talisman, a magical charm that like you can look into. It's like, this is where the crystal ball comes from. Although most of the time people didn't have big like basketball sized crystal balls. They had like ones that fit in the palm of your hand, and that was like a magic rock if it was a clear crystal, and then you could look in it and you could see stuff. We literally have that. We complain because we have to recharge them all the time. So yeah, we haven't done, we can't do everything that Jesus did, but we can do a lot of it. Some incredible things have been accomplished through the miracle of modern science. So the question becomes, okay, Ben, I see your premise, but can you like back it up? Can you back up? This is kind of the conclusion to the argument. How do we like back up this? Because what my point is that Christianity actually caused modern science. And so to think about this, what we need to think about is the scientific method. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how the scientific method works. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few different, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different alternative explanations for like what actually created science. I'm going to make the case that like it wasn't that, it was really Christianity. So we're going to go through 5 different things, and I'm going to make the case that it wasn't that thing, it was Christianity. And the 5 things are this. The first one will be the Stone Age. The second one will be the ancient Greeks, Greek technology, and then we'll have Islam, China, and then the idea that like atheism created science. So we'll start with the Stone Age. So the idea here with the Stone Age is basically the argument is that like science was never created. It just kind of always existed, and there was never a point where somebody like or a culture like actually created science. And so therefore it goes all the way back to the Stone Age, which is like the origins of humanity. They were already instantly. It's just always been a thing. And so the example that like is given in books that I've read is imagine a woman out picking berries, and she's got to carry the berries in her hand, and then she has this idea to like take grass and weave it into like a basket shape, and then she can carry like way more berries. And in fact, from what I've seen, the first baskets were probably just like flat sheets, and you could kind of fold them up on the sides a little bit, but it took a while for baskets to develop into full-blown like have like a bottom with like sides. But even the flat sheet basket was, it's kind of like your hand. It's just like a big version of your hand, and it can carry quite a bit, and you can set it down and go pick berries and pile them up on it. And so it's pretty awesome. And the idea is like some woman in the Stone Age who like was picking berries and had this idea. Was she a scientist? And some people have argued that she was in fact a scientist. But from what I've seen, the consensus of the experts is like no. And what this fails to account for is exactly what the Greeks did later on, because everything up to the ancient Greeks didn't count as science. It counts as like invention, creation, craft, technology. So you could call her an inventor, and she sort of came up with a hypothesis in her head, and then she built the thing and like tested it, and then it worked, and so she was like, okay, it works. She drew her conclusions, and so you might think like, okay, she's a scientist, and that's not quite accurate, because what she was not doing theoretical science. In other words, a theory in science means something different from what it means when we use the word in everyday life. In science, it means like a big explanation for how the world works in general. So something like force equals mass times acceleration. Or like some sort of grand explanation. There's a famous scientist by the name of Charles Darwin who explained the point this way. He said, if you think that the woman with a basket, created science, then I guess a modern geologist, doing modern geological science, a modern geologist should just sit in a ditch and count all the white rocks and all the red rocks and write it down and report his findings. Like there's no like grand theoretical explanation behind that he's then going to go out and test with. Like, so like in science, you need to come up with some kind of grand explanation that makes specific predictions based on that theory, and that specific prediction is called a hypothesis, and you can test the hypothesis because it's a very specific prediction, and then like that will confirm your grand like larger theory or law that you've come up with. So like Einstein said that like gravity, that matter warps space, and so that leads to a hypothesis that, like, he said, he gave a very specific theory. His theory of general relativity was very specific in exactly how much gravity warps space. So then if we know the mass of the sun and the mass of the moon and that kind of thing, then, like, we will know that, like, the moon will warp the space around it a certain amount, a very specific amount. And therefore, the light, during a solar eclipse, light comes around the edge of the moon, and we can measure how much it's been, warped. And if it's been put on like a curved trajectory towards the Earth, and it's curved just exactly the amount that Einstein's theory predicted it would, then his theory is predicting a more specific hypothesis about the moon that we can then test. And then that became the affirmation of his larger general theory of relativity, that in general matter warps space. So, yeah, the Stone Age didn't have science. This idea of big, grand, like, theories that explain how things work was really something that the ancient Greeks did, basically around 500 BC, sort of the 6 to 400 range of sort of their, like, golden era, where all kinds of cool stuff happened in ancient Greece. And so they came up with the idea of, like, theoretical science. Coming up with, like, theories in your head and then thinking about them really hard and, like, then applying that to, like, create technology based on your theories. So, like, and a famous example, there was a Greek city that needed, like, an escape tunnel because of an invading army. And they needed to dig a tunnel, like, through a mountain. And the problem is, in the ancient world, you can only dig a tunnel as fast as two guys can dig. Because the digging tools you use are the shovel and the pick. The pick breaks up the dirt, the shovel scoops out the dirt. If you go from two guys and you up it to like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guys, the problem is you're really just digging a wider tunnel, and they didn't need it any wider than just two guys. Two guys is plenty wide enough for an escape tunnel through the mountain. So they can only, they can rotate out and have two fresh guys 24/7, but that's the best they can do. So the Greeks used geometry and applied it to the real world, and they came up with these, geometrical concepts, and they said, okay, we measure this distance here and sight over this distance here. You dig at this spot on the mountain at this angle, then the two tunnels will meet up. And it worked. And they were only off by, like, I think, like 5 feet. And, they had, like, wooden squares and, like, the earliest surveying equipment. So that's an example of, like, how Greek technology was greatly improved because of Greek theoretical science. And it led to, like, what's called the Greek Golden Age of, like, dramatic breakthroughs. Like, before the Greeks, nobody had systems of gears for, like, cranes for lifting heavy objects. So it's very difficult to explain how the ancient Egyptians before them lifted those heavy stones for their pyramids. Whereas if you fast forward from, the Great Pyramids built in 2600 BC, if you fast forward 2,000 years to the time of the Greeks, around 500 BC, it's not that hard to explain how you would lift heavy rocks then, because they had systems of gears and winches and cranes. So, like, that kind of gives you an example of how Greek theoretical science was really a big breakthrough and really a great, like, leap forward. But it had limitations. So the limitations were what Christianity later surpassed, broke through. And then this led to the modern miracle of modern science, which is, the real leap forward. It's like an insane leap forward. Like I said, Abraham Lincoln had more in common with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob than he did with us in terms of, science and technology. So, the missing piece of the Greek idea was that they would not test their theoretical reasoning with observational experiments. They wouldn't go out and observe things. And the most famous example is that all of their philosophical schools were certain that heavy rocks fall faster than lightweight rocks. Now, in reality, acceleration due to gravity is constant. It doesn't matter how heavy the rock is, it will fall to the ground at the same speed. And they will hit they fall with the same acceleration from 0 And however, they start with 0 speed, and then by the time they get to the ground, they're going to accelerate in a constant acceleration. So it's like 32.2 feet per second squared. So like for every second that passes, the speed of the rock increases by 32.2 feet per second, or by 9.8 meters per second. So the problem was that the Greeks were essentially, it's like, have you ever done a math problem where you work really hard to like understand this math problem, and then you look in the back of the book, and the back of the book had a different answer from you, and you're so angry that like you start to wonder if maybe the back of the book's wrong? Well, you can think of an observational experiment as sort of like, it's kind of like looking in the back of the book. Because if you never look in the back of the book, then you're just trusting your own reasoning about the math problem. But when you look in the back of the book, you're kind of double checking it. And so the problem is that like you can make mental errors in your reasoning, in your theoretical science. And experiments are good at like showing you that like, okay, you've made a mistake somewhere because it just doesn't fit with observational reality. But the Greeks were so certain in their theoretical reasoning that they would never do that. So like the best physics that they ever had was Aristotle's physics, and they never questioned the rocks thing. So that's a pretty big problem for Greek science. That's a huge barrier that they had, and the barrier didn't get crossed until Christianity crossed it. And the interesting thing is, even within the later Christian times, that barrier was still a hard-fought debate for the people that wanted to, use observational experiments. So like here's the explanation, what was the theoretical reasoning that led to them thinking that heavy rocks fall faster? Well, it worked like this. They started with a premise that nature abhors a vacuum. Now, there were different schools of philosophical thought for how they would have come up with that premise. So like the Platonists and Plato and those guys would have said that like we conceive of it in our mind because in our mind we're able to access the world of the perfect. And whereas the Aristotle school would have said that like we come up with, that original observation based on observations. But the issue is so Aristotle said that like we get information through observations, and the Platonists would have said that like no, in our mind, in our mental world, we're accessing the world of the perfect that we can't see, that can't be observed, that can only be accessed through mental reasoning. So like Plato would have said that like there's no perfect circles in this world, but we can conceive mathematically of a perfect circle. But there's no actual perfect circles that can ever be drawn. So he said there was this world of Platonic forms of perfect things. Aristotle denied the world of forms, and so he said that like our idea of like a circle, of a perfect circle, comes from having observed bunches of different circles, and that's how we come up with the idea of a perfect circle. So like the thing is, even Aristotle, who kind of had some observational starting point for his idea, he still thought that the way to build on that was through pure theoretical reasoning. So this is how his theoretical reasoning worked for like the rocks falling twice as fast. Aristotle said that like nature abhors a vacuum, and that's sort of that starting premise. And then he said like therefore anything that moves is overcoming friction because it's moving through some sort of stuff. Even the stars and the planets that move through the sky, they're not moving through empty space because nature abhors a vacuum, so they're moving through stuff, so therefore they're overcoming friction. So therefore, since they're overcoming friction, the only way they can keep moving is if a force is continuing to be applied to them, some sort of pusher. So all of the Greek philosophical schools were dedicated to the concept of pushers, especially for the planets and the celestial objects that move through the sky. They believed in pushers. So like, now what exactly the pusher was would vary from school to school, but essentially like Aristotle put it like this, like the rocks things that move have to be alive, or like they're moved by something that is alive because they're overcoming friction. So like the rocks that fall to the earth, the rocks that are twice as heavy love the center of the earth twice as much. So that's why they, that's why they fall like that. So like this was the problem really for them was that they rejected observational corrections on their theorizing. If they were really confident in their theorizing, then that was that. Now, the weird thing, and this is the weird part that's hard for us to understand, they knew how to do observational experiments. It's not really that complicated. Greece is full of mountains, and you could go out there and just drop two rocks off, a big one and a little one, and just observe that they hit the ground at the same time. The idea of observational science had occurred to them. It's not like they didn't have the idea. They knew what it was. And they did it from time to time, very begrudgingly and ashamedly. So that was the problem was not that they didn't, it's not that Christianity created the scientific method or the idea of using experiments to test your scientific theories. Christianity didn't create that idea. That idea had always existed. What Christianity created was the idea that that's a good thing. That was the real breakthrough for Christians. Because for the ancient Greeks, that was seen as a bad thing. So, a classic example is the Greek scientist named Archimedes, who came later. Archimedes is famous because he discovered the principle of displacement. He had like a strangely shaped object and he wanted to know the volume of the object, and it would be very difficult to like figure out what the volume is. And so he like realized that he could put the object in water and then measure the displacement of how much the water level rose. And then the volume of water that it rose up would be the equivalent of the object. And he famously said, Eureka. And so this is the famous Eureka, when he figured this out. In Archimedes' case, there were some geometry problems that he couldn't figure out just by thinking in his head. And so he had to build some physical models to help him figure out these geometry problems. And he literally, directly, explicitly, in his writings, expressed his personal shame for having to do that. So that's kind of an example, like, just in general, Aristotle famously said there's nothing noble about a workshop. The Greeks thought that, like, physical labor slowed the mind and lowered one's sort of overall nobility and status, you know what I mean? So like there was this dedication to the mental and the glory of the intellect, and that was really the problem that Christianity broke through. Christianity created the scientific method really in the 1100s with the creation of the university, and they were all Christian. And then this movement started in the late 1100s for what they called the experimental method that we today would call the scientific method, where they're like, okay, we're going to test our theories. Our theoretical reasoning is going to be tested with observation and experiment. And this movement was kind of an underground movement because the dominant idea was the older Greek idea that you should keep everything purely mental. And there's something wrong with you if you need to test that. There's something wrong with you mentally. And then it was sort of an underground movement. And then in the early 1200s, there was a certain guy at the universities named Roger Bacon. And Roger Bacon is generally credited with kind of like the guy, like sort of the granddaddy of science, if you look him up online. Although he actually got the idea from the generation that came right before him, from his professors. But he was really kind of the key guy because Roger Bacon was afraid to write because the idea of the scientific method, the experimental method, was so controversial. But the Pope knew what was going on, and he ordered Roger Bacon to write for him. He ordered Roger Bacon to write for him. So in 1 year of feverish effort, He wrote, I can't remember if it's the Opus Majus or the Majus Opus. I'm not good with Latin. But it was like his grand work, his big work. And major work, I guess. And in this, he argued for experimental science. And, he said, okay, Aristotle said that, a cold bowl of water, if you put, that will freeze slower than a hot bowl of water. You heard me right. That Aristotle said that, the cold bowl will freeze. It will take longer to freeze than the hot bowl. And who knows what theoretical reasoning Aristotle would have based that off of. And it may have just been a hypothetical example that Roger Bacon created. But it makes his point. That, what Roger Bacon said, if you want to test that, if you want to know if that's true, you don't need to consult Aristotle's books. You don't need to think through his reasoning. You need to just get two bowls and put them outside and watch and wait. On a day when it's snowing outside or it's cold outside. And just watch and wait and see what happens. And Roger Bacon made an argument based on the second commandment in the Ten Commandments. That is the commandment that thou shalt make, no graven image. It's a commandment against idolatry. What Roger Bacon argued was that our refusal to let experimental observation correct our mental theorizing is a form of mental idolatry. We have made our own reasoning and deductive reasoning an idol. And we need to allow the observation to correct it. And so, what Christianity brought to the table in this issue was humility, Christian humility. Christianity had this grand tradition that all people are sinful and deserve to go to hell and need correction from God and training from God and that sort of thing. And so that was really a key breakthrough. That idea of human depravity, of original sin, of human sinfulness, and the fact that everyone deserves to go to hell, as Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by God's grace. That idea just wasn't present in any of the Greek philosophical schools. The whole idea, the basis of the cross, or why Jesus came to die, is because we're sinners and we're sinful, is the basis of humility in Christianity. It's like, how arrogant can I be when I deserve to go to hell forever? And so that became a basis for Christian humility, that became a basis for sitting back and saying, okay, maybe I made a mental mistake somewhere, and I don't want to get into this form of taking my ideas and making false idols out of them. I want to allow observation to correct my mistakes. So Christianity played a direct causal. This was a very explicit thing that happened, and this led to, over time, the experimental method group, the people in the tradition of Roger Bacon, eventually won the day in the Christian universities. The argument went back and forth, and eventually they prevailed. But this was kind of the key turning point, Roger Bacon. Okay, so there we have the Greeks. Let's move on and we'll talk about Islam. Now, in the Muslim world, this will be a little bit easier to talk about because all we have going on in the Muslim world is essentially a continuation of Greek ideas. Oh, there's one thing in the Greek world that we really should talk about. We'll add this in too. Every Greek philosophical school was dedicated to the idea that time was cyclical. That everything that had been created in their time had also been created in the past and forgotten and will one day be forgotten. And they thought that they were at a golden age in 500 BC. And Christianity did not have this dedication to cyclical time. Christianity saw time as linear, as God having created the world and then moving it towards a goal. That will become much more important later when we talk about China. But just to kind of get that on the table, let's move on and we'll talk about the Muslim world or the world of Islam. The Muslim world did not move past Greek ideas, and eventually they brought something new to the table that actually just made things worse and made them worse off than the Greeks. So in the Muslim world, there's no evidence that they ever move past Greek ideas. And the famous example is this guy named Ibn al-Haytham, which if you look up Ibn al-Haytham, that's I-B-N, second word A-L, third word H-A-Y-T-H-M, Ibn al-Haytham. And you'll find articles that say he was the first scientist. The first scientist was a Muslim, that sort of thing. That's not exactly inaccurate, but it's not the whole picture. He was this Muslim scientist in like the 11th century, so that's not the 1100s, that's the thousands. I think if I remember right. Let me make sure I have Ibn al-Haytham. Okay, let's get his... Never mind, I've got like a radically... Oh, okay, different dating system. Born 965 AD. Okay, so that's about when he lived. Okay, so he was an astronomer. He did stuff with light. He did he did theoretical science with optics, trying to understand how light works. And he actually used like the full scientific method. And he even recognized, this was key, this was really something that he kind of added to it. He recognized that like the repeatability of his scientific experiment made it stronger, it gave it a stronger rational justification. It made it more credible. But the problem is that like the idea of the experimental method was not new, had always existed. The Greeks did it from time to time. And so there's nothing really that interesting about Ibn al-Haytham doing it one time. The issue is, did he recognize that should be done all the time? Because that's what Roger Bacon argued for, that like we should always check our theoretical reasoning with observation. We should always, because you may make a mental mistake somewhere. Okay, now it's possible that your mental reasoning is like so strong that like it's like 1 + 1 = 2. I don't care what I observe, But when it gets complicated, it's possible that you made a mistake. So you should always check it with like experimental reasoning. The issue is Ibn al-Haytham never argued for the experimental method as a good thing. He just did it this one time. But that's nothing different from anything that the Greeks did. But he did recognize that like there was something to the fact that he could repeat his experiment, which was a very important movement forward. But he still apparently was ashamed of the fact that he used the experimental method in his research on light or optics. And you say, Ben, why do you say that he apparently was? He never said that he explicitly was ashamed of it. He never said explicitly that he was proud of it. He never defended the experimental method as a good thing. And the key piece of evidence here is that he did later work on the moon. And in this later work, he did not use the experimental method at all. He did purely theoretical reasoning. And it was quite a big work on the moon that he published. So like, this is good evidence that he was just continuing the Greek thing. But the fascinating thing is, the medieval Christians, specifically Roger Bacon and probably his professors that came before him, Roger Bacon explicitly was aware of Ibn al-Haytham's work on optics, recognized that he used the experimental method, and said, we should be doing that all the time. And he used this experiment on optics that Ibn al-Haytham did as like an example of what we should be doing all the time. But his argument was that we should be doing this all the time. So instead of being ashamed of having to do it one time because you couldn't come up with purely mental theorizing, Roger Bacon and the Christians were like, we should be humble enough to test everything with experiments. That was really the breakthrough. Now, that's not the whole story with Muslims, because later on, a guy became very influential as a Muslim theologian named Al-Ghazali, and he embraced a doctrine called occasionalism. And so what he said was that matter does not exist from second to second. It passes out of existence. So like, water has certain properties that make it what it is. It flows downhill. Water flows downhill. Water fits the shape of the container that it's in. Water puts out fire. And those are the properties of water. But if that water does not exist from second to second and goes out of existence, what Al-Ghazali said is the only reason water continues to exist is because God keeps recreating it constantly over and over and over again. And he didn't just say that about water, he said that about every physical substance that exists. So the only reason water, runs downhill is because God recreated it, because God chose for it to continue to do so. So what water does is not based on the properties of water. It's based on God's will to continue to recreate it in that way. And this is called occasionalism. So on the basis of this, Al-Ghazali rejected the idea of like law in nature, of scientific law, that there are laws, immutable laws that the world runs on, like force equals mass times acceleration, or kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. That's always the way things work. So he rejected this whole idea of Greek theorizing and then the whole idea of law in nature. And in the Muslim world, there was opposition to him, but eventually he prevailed. And the opposition to him came from a school of thought under this guy named Averroes. And Averroes was very much opposed to occasionalism. But Averroes, the problem with him was he was more diehard dedicated to Greek ideas than like, it seems like even the Greeks. Like Averroes said, if you found anything, if you even observed anything that didn't agree with Aristotle's reasoning, then there was something wrong with your observation. And so those were the only two schools of thought in the Muslim world. And then the Al-Ghazali occasionalist idea won the day. So he wanted to reject all the philosophers that came before him. Now, the interesting thing is, like, well, why didn't this happen in the Christian world? It seems like Christians could have embraced the theology of occasionalism, but it just didn't. Well, that idea existed within Christian theological debate, but the other idea of scientific law also existed. Or back in the medieval world, there were schools of thought in Christian theology, especially at the universities, that wholeheartedly embraced the idea of scientific law, or what they called secondary causation, which is the idea that God controls everything that happens because God created something with certain properties and he knew what would happen in the future. So he controlled what happens in the future with how he created things in the first place. So like, he knew that like the water would run downhill, because he gave it those properties, and he knew that like everything that was going to happen because he knew the properties of everything he created, and he knew that if everything just runs how he created it, it's like God built the universe like a machine, and God knew exactly how the machine was going to run because he's a master builder. And that idea dominated the Christian universities. Another problem for Muslims was that they believed Muhammad was like the final revelation, and there was going to be no further, that was it. There was nothing more to learn about theology and about God. And so that was a problem too, sort of an anti-progress type thing. But essentially the question becomes like, well, why did the Christians, pull this off and the Muslims didn't? Well, the Muslims certainly did not have this, the thing is, I can't make a good argument. It seems like the Muslim concept of God is probably capable of creating science, but it just didn't. That's just not how it happened. Maybe they weren't humble enough, like with the whole mental idolatry thing, but that doesn't seem to be what their problem was. Rather, the problem seems to be that for whatever reason they embraced this occasionalism, and that was the end of the story for them. Whereas the Christians, ultimately, the idea was present, but they embraced the idea of scientific law or like secondary causation. And the problem is that both occasionalism and secondary causation, which is the basis of our idea of scientific law, it's a theological thing. It's like both of those are essentially different ways of viewing God's glory. But the Christian one, leads to all kinds of scientific progress and things like that. Whereas the Muslim one is very like, it's sort of like we can't know what's going to happen, and it sort of removes the responsibility for humans to even do anything to affect their world, because, everything that happens is not based on a scientific law. And honestly, it just seems kind of dumb, because it says that, like, I don't know, to me it seems like God would, have sort of a plan for how things work that worked out from a long time ago. And it seems like Muslims should have recognized that, but for whatever reason they didn't. Okay. Let's get to China, because this is an interesting one about the causal link between Christianity and science. Because here, the Christians, unlike with the Muslims and with the Greeks, the Christians were not interacting with the Chinese philosophical schools and the Chinese academies and the Chinese, versions of science. There was no interaction. These were totally, not totally isolated, but pretty much isolated. And so things took a very different route in the Christian world as opposed to the Chinese world. So in China, the issue is that the common people had their religion, and the noble, elite, wealthy people had theirs. And so the common people just believed in traditional pagan polytheism. Going to temples, making sacrifices to gods. They made sacrifices to their ancestors, just like in the Greek and Roman world. They had ancestral gods and that sort of thing. But the rich people, the noble elite, like, embraced Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. But all of these are atheistic religions. The Tao is conceived of as a impersonal essence behind how everything works. It is not a personal being. It is explicitly not personal. It's just sort of like, it's supernatural, so we tend to not think of it as atheistic, but technically it's atheistic, because it's just saying there's some sort of supernatural, like, essence that controls how everything works, but it's not looking out for you. It doesn't have wishes or desires. It's just sort of the supernatural law of reality that doesn't care what happens. And then Confucianism, as best I understand it, is just like a moral code of life that's more specific, that's based on a particular view of the Tao. And then Buddhism is explicitly atheistic too, because Buddha's basic idea was that, like, not only does God not exist, you don't exist. You need to recognize that nobody exists, especially you yourself. There is no I. There is no personal self, and then you can't really suffer because you don't exist. And so his whole idea was, he was actually born a Hindu in India, and he wanted to get out of the cycle of reincarnation and karma, and he said, once you realize that, like, you don't exist, you can't suffer anymore. So Buddha's idea was not just that God doesn't exist, but nobody exists. When the common people in China embraced Buddhism and embraced Taoism, they modified it and brought their polytheism and brought countless gods into their temples. So there's popular Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, and then there's the Buddhism of the founders. So those two things are not the same thing. Now here's the issue. The intellectuals of China were among the wealthy elite. Those are the people who are really going to be doing the science work, who really have the spare time to be working on science. And in China, you had all these, like, brilliant people come along, create all these amazing inventions, and they had the printing press in, like, 1000 AD, and yet they only used it to make cooking recipes and poetry. They invented gunpowder around the same time, but they only used it for fireworks for purposes of magic. They experimented with some cannons, but then they just gave up on it. Like, whereas when the Europeans came across the Indian Ocean from Africa, sailed around Africa, the Chinese didn't have any cannons. And the Europeans were able to very easily take over all trade on the Indian Ocean because they had cannons. So the issue is that the idea from the intellectual elite of China was that the Tao cannot be comprehended with mere human language. That it would be a joke for us to think that we could comprehend the impersonal essence behind everything. We can't even explain it with our words are too simplified. Now the interesting question about that is I could see how that could be part of Christian theology too. Why didn't Christians come to the view that God was too hard for us to understand and that we can't possibly comprehend God's purpose in creating the world, God's blueprint for how He created the world? Because ultimately, scientific law and law and nature and theories are essentially, they're just an attempt to find God's underlying blueprint that He based His creation of the world on. That's what Christians are looking for. And so, why didn't Christians come to the same conclusion like the Chinese did? Because the Chinese concluded that, we can't explain how everything works because that would be trying to understand the Tao. And, whereas the Christians didn't go that route. And it's very interesting, why didn't the Christians go that route? Well, from the earliest church fathers, when I say church fathers, I mean, you've got the time of the New Testament, which essentially closed, done by 90 AD. The New Testament is all wrapped up. And then you've got the next century of 100 to 200 AD, where we have the writings of different influential Christians. And then we've got 200 to 300, and these are the early church father eras. Then we got 300 to 400, and that kind of ends the era of the church fathers. The early days of Christianity, Christians working on theology, trying to understand the Trinity, trying to deal with different heresies, trying to get their different views on different things nailed down, trying to analyze and create systematized understandings of what the New Testament says, and arguing back and forth about which ones are right. Christian theology, from the days of the earliest church fathers, was always heavily dependent on using reason to understand God. Whereas in China, that would have been seen as just ridiculous. You can't use mere human reason to understand the Tao. So the issue in Christianity is of course they could do science and use human reason to comprehend the world because they were already comfortable doing it in theology to comprehend God. And the Christians had always been dedicated to that. So the question becomes why were the Christians dedicated to the use of reason in this way for theology? Well, there's two basic reasons. The first reason is the Greeks were already on that page. They were already doing that. The Greeks were a little too arrogant in how they did it. But every Greek philosophical school had come to the conclusion there must be some sort of one supreme God based on philosophical arguments. But how do I put it? They differed wildly in their theology, and they argued back and forth. And the Christians came in with a very different theology. So the Christians kind of inherited this whole Greek thing. So that's one difference. But then the other important thing is that the Christians already had this linear view of time and God's revelation throughout time. So they believed, and it was just part of the biblical, what the Bible said, what it literally said, the biblical text actually said was filled with ancient prophecies about Jesus Christ that were very difficult to understand. And people came up with all sorts of different interpretations of what those prophecies said. And those prophecies were, the correct interpretation of them was revealed directly, someone's texting me, were revealed, like when Christianity, when Jesus Christ like founded Christianity, all of a sudden the correct interpretation of those prophecies was revealed. And so there was this, at the core of Christianity, there was this idea that God had secrets that he was giving clues about that were going to be slowly revealed, and more could be discovered. And so there was this dedication to the idea that there's a secret waiting to be discovered. And Christianity had that had always been part of Christianity. And it was possible to be really, really, really wrong in what you thought you had figured out. So like, Jesus and his apostles had totally wrong idea. Well, not Jesus, but the apostles of Jesus had totally the wrong idea about what Jesus, who the Messiah was, and who, what the prophecies about the Messiah really said. So they had totally the wrong idea. Whereas the Christians had at their starting point this idea of like a secret to be uncovered. And then there was this additional book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. It's at the end of the New Testament now, but it's a book within the New Testament that includes like tons of cryptic prophecies that are very difficult to comprehend, very difficult to understand. And so Christianity had this idea of like a secret to be revealed. Later on, when Christians create, so the origin of the Christian movement to create science really is with Roger Bacon. But on the tail end of it, in the 1500s, when like the experimental method like wins and prevails within Christianity, you have another guy named Francis Bacon, and he even argued in favor of the experimental method. And he actually made an argument on the basis of Genesis, and he just argued that there was a mandate in Genesis for humanity to have dominion over the earth, over the animals, over all the world. And so he said it shouldn't be so difficult for us to control the world. There should be some sort of way for us to control the world. And that was sort of like the icing on the cake. By the time that he's arguing that, it's like they're landing the final blows, against the old Greek view of science, of purely theoretical, purely deductive science. Deductive reasoning's good, because that's what gives us 1 + 1 = 2. But like, you can do way too much deductive reasoning without stepping back and like testing it to see if you made a mistake somewhere. But yeah, Christians had this linear view of both time and God's revelation, and that like certain people, like even within the book of Acts, you've got Paul being called to this like mission to spread Christianity to these places, and a prophet is sent, and like he's slowly learning more and more about his specific calling and how God's using him to transform the world. Because he's like, okay, he thought it was going to be one way, and as you go through the book of Acts and as you go through Paul's mission, he slowly learns more and more about this mission that he's on. But like, it is, the Lord is revealing more and more to him. He's also learning some things through his experience. Like, there's at one point during it where he says, I'm not going to go to the Jews anymore, I'm only going to go to the Gentiles. But he had a specific set of Gentile nations that he was intent on spreading the gospel to, and it had to do with like these nations that like apparently the Jews believe God founded a long time ago, but the devil corrupted, because God had sent angels to found these nations, and those angels rebelled against God, and like that was the classic Jewish view. And so Paul seems to be on this big strategy to like undo that. And so that's just an example of what I'm talking about, that like Christianity sort of permeated throughout with this idea that like God has got like a plan for your life, and he's like slowly revealing more and more about it, and there's clues all along the way, and there's this big invasion that, you know, is happening, because the idea was that this was the devil's world. The devil had taken it over and was running it, and then Jesus was like this invader that came and established this like beachhead, and then there was this spiritual invasion that was taking place that like transformed the world, and it was very much like a military mission type thing, and you didn't want the devil to always know what you're up to. But like the point is that there was this dedication to this idea of secret, and especially it's there in Christianity. You have God prophesying about the Messiah, all of these cryptic prophecies that very few people even had close to a correct understanding of. And then when some people did have a closer one than others, but then when Jesus comes, there was a spectrum of how bad people's interpretation of the prophecies was. But then when Jesus comes, he kind of sets people straight. And so that's kind of the point, is that they didn't have that in China. With the atheistic Tao, nobody's walking with us through this process. Nobody's giving us hints and clues, and we're not learning more and more. There's no idea of progress. In fact, the Chinese view was that the days of like Confucius were like the golden age, and everything's downhill from there. So Christianity had the humility, but it also had the idea that there was a secret waiting to be discovered. And Jesus ultimately was the embodiment of that. But there were certainly examples of more of that. And if you have that idea present, then you'll never get into this Taoist idea that like we can't possibly comprehend. You'll never go down that road. And so that's why the Chinese, even though they had created tons of brilliant inventions and had lots of brilliant people, they had an unsupportive culture. You know, the worst example is there was a Chinese explorer who created these like better sailing ships and probably would have sailed around Africa first before the Europeans, except he died. But like as soon as he died, they didn't like how he was bringing new ideas and corrupting their perfection. So they ordered that all of his ships be destroyed. All the plans for how to build his ships be destroyed. They banned anyone from building ships that could sail the high seas, and you can't go sailing that far away from China anymore. And he had brought African animals back to the zoo in the Emperor's zoo in China, and like they ordered that all those animals be killed. So China had this very anti-progress, like unsupportive culture, and Christianity was like dedicated to progress and the idea of progress. Things were getting better and better. Satan had taken over this world, but there's like this invasion and God's taking it back. You know? And they were dedicated to using reason to understand theology and to understand God and ultimately to do science. And the reason why they were dedicated to using reason is they were essentially using every tool at their disposal, and reason just seemed to be the one that worked the best. But they were just ready to use whatever they could, you know. So there's just one more thingy for us to cover here, and then we can wrap this video up. It's the idea that atheism created science. This is called the Conflict Thesis, if you want to look it up. The Conflict Thesis is the idea that like religion is always in conflict with science, and science only grows and becomes stronger and prevails as religion declines. And so it's the idea that like religion did not cause the creation of science. Christianity did not cause the creation of science. Rather, Christianity weakened, and as it weakened over time, science got stronger. Now, one of the main problems with this idea is that it's a very old idea that is rejected by all of the experts. So if you look up the Conflict Thesis, you know, you're going to find that like the consensus of the expert historians in this is that it's just wrong. There's a bunch of problems with it. One is that it creates this like miracle where, you know, science was kind of created overnight and Christianity like died, and then science suddenly blossoms in this overnight miracle. But the real story is that like you start with Roger Bacon and those guys, And then their side of experimental science keeps making leaps forward until you get to Copernicus around the year 1500. And then he puts the sun at the center of the solar system, which is like a big leap forward. And then you have a bunch of leaps forward that happen from 1500 to Isaac Newton in 1700. And so that's sort of like, there's like a golden era from 1500 to 1700, a great explosion of scientific progress. And so there were some atheists who argued in the 1700s that like this era between 15 and 1700, they called it like this era of like where atheism, they would even argue that like these scientists during this era were like all closeted atheists. And, the power of religion weakened and then science moved forward. But the problem with that argument is that science did move forward radically fast from 1500 to 1700. From when Copernicus in 1500 put the sun at the center of the solar system, there's a ton of things that happen until you get to Isaac Newton, who's got his laws of motion and gravity and that kind of thing. You got people like Galileo, Kepler, these guys in there making leaps forward. The issue is that those leaps forward were actually built on major things that were figured out before them. So, like, for example, why was the sun never put at the center of the solar system until Copernicus around 1500? Well, the problem was that the traditional Greek idea, the old idea was that, like, the earth can't possibly be moving or else we would feel it moving. And they said you should always feel a wind blowing towards you. And they said that, like, if you shoot an arrow up in the air, it should fall behind you because you're moving. And what they lacked was the concept of inertia. That, like, well, the arrow has inertia because we're moving on the earth, at like hundreds of miles an hour as like the earth rotates. But the arrow and I both have that same inertia. So to me, I don't notice that, it doesn't fall behind me. It falls as though we were both motionless and then I shot it. Or like if you're riding in a car and you throw an apple up, it falls down in your hand as though you're not moving, even though you and the car are both moving at 55 miles an hour. It's the same idea. That idea of inertia didn't exist because of the ideas of Aristotle, because he didn't believe in inertia. But this breakthrough of the creation of the idea of inertia really came before Copernicus. One of the major guys there were people like Robert Grosseteste and, importantly, William of Ockham argued, and they called it the idea of impetus. And it was a point that they argued and defended, and they had essentially created the whole concept of inertia. And once that was created, then it became scientifically viable for Copernicus to say, like, okay, maybe the sun's at the center and we're moving around it. And there were a bunch of other arguments that like the earth couldn't move. So all of this explosion of science was really the product of long, hard-fought centuries from like 1200 to 1500, those 300 years. So the consensus today is that, like, no, this is a long process of one scientist building on the ones who came before them. And each one advancing things further forward. Taking the next logical step, taking the next logical step, taking the next logical step. The other problem is that there was no conflict between religion and science until Copernicus came along and said that the sun was at the center of the solar system. So for those 300 years of the experimental method, there was never any conflict. But there were radical arguments and debates going on, but there was never like a conflict between what the Bible says and what science says. It wasn't until you got to that point where you said the earth is moving around the sun, because some people interpreted some passages where it says the earth does not move, and those passages were like seen as saying that the earth can't possibly be revolving around the sun. Well, the earth does not move doesn't have to be taken in that literal way. He might be talking about how solid it is, But the point is that was when you first had a conflict. And the problem is that the conflict between religion and science over where the sun and the earth are in relation to each other, that happened at the exact same time that the Protestant Reformation happened. And so the Catholic Church was feeling very threatened in those days. And that led to Galileo getting actually imprisoned for disagreeing with the Catholic Church. But that wasn't the whole reason he got imprisoned. There was also this whole, he basically called anyone who disagreed with him an idiot. He literally, using ugly words, and especially he called out the Pope. He was a very arrogant guy who went around talking about how smart he was. And the thing was, when Copernicus created his system, where the sun was in the center, it was actually super inaccurate. And the older Ptolemaic system that the Greeks had come up with, where the earth was in the center of the universe, actually was more observationally accurate at the first. Copernicus' system was not as accurate because Copernicus had the sun in the center, but he had everything moving in circular orbits, which wasn't really accurate to what we observe of the planets and the stars and everything. And it took a while before this guy named Kepler came along and realized that the orbits were actually elliptical, and then everything was where it was supposed to be and on time. So this conflict is a little bit overblown, and the point is that this explosion of science from 1500 to 1700, research has been done into all of the stars of this scientific era, and they were all either very devout Christians or explicitly made it clear that they were Christians. So there was one guy of the group that was actually an atheist. Everyone else was very much a Christian or even a devout Christian. Isaac Newton famously wrote more about the Bible than he did and theology than he did about science. And so it's just not true. It requires you to believe in this kind of overnight miracle that there's no actual evidence for. And if you understand the story of how things actually happened, there's no reason to think that religion is always in conflict with science. And there's this idea that there's this conflict between religion and science, but there's no conflict between atheism and science. And that's not really true. There can be specific conflicts between what the Bible says specifically and science. So if the Bible, you talk about the earth being created in 6 days, that is a conflict, but that's not a conflict between Christianity in general. That's a very specific thing that the Bible talks about. So it's more of a superficial conflict. But there's actually a conflict between atheism and science that's more fundamental, that's more basic, because the problem with atheism is that if atheism is true, then nobody created us. Human life and the human brain originated through blind natural processes of evolution. And who's to say that my brain would actually give me true beliefs instead of false beliefs, And that's a whole other argument that we can't address in this video. But I just would direct you to Alvin Plantinga's argument, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, we'll just say atheism. But anyway, that's enough for this video. Thank you for your time.